us started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Katie Weldon, and I am the Programming Director for the Mississippi Gulf Coast Chamber of Commerce, and I also have the honor to be the Military Affairs Liaison, which means I am responsible for the Coast Centurion Association. And a lot of you might be asking yourself, well, what is the Coast Centurion Association? And this association was dedicated to keeping the military installations here on the coast. And it's kind of transformed into that. We have military affairs committees on the Gulfport and Biloxi Chamber of Commerce's, but we also like to do tours for our members. So you might be asking yourself, hey, how can I become a part of this? Well, it's 100 members who give $100 each year, and they get to participate in stuff that you might not be able to. So normally we would be taking tours with the hurricane hunters right now in person, but this is the next best thing we do. We also like to do a lot of volunteer work as well, with laying of the wreaths and with Reman Funeral Home's World War II museum tours. So if this is something you're interested in, please reach out to us. My contact information can be found on our website at mscoastchamber.com, along with an application to join the Coast Centurions. And on that note, I would like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Wilmot and of course Captain Black. Thank you both so much for being here. And Lieutenant Colonel, I will turn it over to you.
I'm actually going to turn it over to Captain Black, who's going to be doing the briefing, but I'll run the slides. So,
all right, well, good morning, everyone. I am Captain Garrett Black. I am what we call an RWO on the WC-130J. So I'm an aerial reconnaissance weather officer, so more or less a meteorologist on board. And Lieutenant Colonel Wilmot here is one of our pilots and the director of operations. And so the way we're going to kind of format this today is we're going to do a little bit brief history on how we became to fly this mission. And then dive a little bit into our hurricane operations and how we go about accomplishing our mission, as well as things that we do outside of the hurricane season. So we'll go ahead and start with our history here. Next slide, please.
Uh-oh, technical difficulty.
First slide.
You're doing great.
It's not working. Click it. There you go. Okay.
There we go. All right, so believe it or not, the Hurricane Hunters actually started on a dare. So it was Lieutenant Colonel Joe Duckworth here, was a pilot back in 1943, so the time period of World War II, obviously. And he was an instructor at Bryan, Texas, just outside of College Station. He was teaching a class of Royal Air Force British pilots, and they had questions and questioned the integrity of the T-6 aircraft that you see pictured on how durable it was and what kind of aircraft it was. So Lieutenant Colonel Joe Duckworth bet his students that he could fly the T-6 out into the Gulf of Mexico, where there was thought to be a developing storm. And so they went on out, flew through the storm, came back, and then the weather officer here, First Lieutenant William Jones Burdick, was like, hey, I think there's a lot of valuable information that we could gather from that. And so he asked Colonel Duckworth if they could go out together and begin to collect data. And I'll turn it over to this video. It goes a little bit more in depth and kind of gives a good brief overview of what our mission entails.
It all started as a dare between two Army Air Corps pilots in 1943. Flight instructor Major Joe Duckworth flew a propeller-driven single-engine T-6 Texan trainer into the eye of a hurricane. He made it out alive, then flew back in a second time, carrying a weather officer along. It was the beginning of how the Air Force collects hurricane data today. In 1944, the 3rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron became the first official group of hurricane hunters. They flew WB-25D Mitchells through the 1944 Great Atlantic Hurricane, reporting data back to the National Hurricane Center. The Mitchells bomb bays were modified to carry extra fuel tanks instead of munitions. These tanks allowed for longer flights. 50 people died in the Great Atlantic Hurricane compared to nearly 700 in the 1938 Great New England Hurricane. The hurricane hunters were credited with keeping the death toll significantly lower by giving out ample warning. The Air Force stripped some B-50 superfortresses of their defensive armament in 1953, equipping them for long-range weather reconnaissance missions. Now called the WB-50, the aircraft had high-altitude atmospheric samplers, Doppler radar, weather radar, and a bomb bay fuel tank for extended range. In 1959, the WC-130B Hercules became operational, followed by the E model in 1962 and then the H model in 1964. The H model flew until 2005 when it was replaced by the current WC-130J. As America entered the space age, the first successful launch of a weather satellite in 1960 helped forecasters detect hurricanes. Satellites still play a big role in forecasting hurricanes, but they don't provide the information needed to predict hurricane development and movement. The Atmospheric Distributed Data System, or ADS, and Omega Dropson Wind Finding System became standard equipment in 1987. The ADS system has sensors that measure temperature, humidity, altitude, wind speed, and direction. The data from these sensors is collected and sent to the National Hurricane Center. Over the years, the hurricane hunters have had many designations and called many airfields home. On November 1st, 1993, the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, as it's known today, was reactivated and assigned to the Air Force Reserve. In 2007, the stepped frequency microwave radiometer was added to the Hurricane Hunters arsenal of technology to continuously measure surface winds and rainfall rates below the aircraft. The mission of the Hurricane Hunters makes it possible to give advance warning of hurricanes, increasing the accuracy of storm predictions.
All right, so that was a good overview of kind of how our mission became and how we've gotten to where we are today, as well as it discussed a lot of different types of equipment that we use. And so we'll kind of dive in a little bit more into the equipment and how we actually operationally get to where we go to be able to collect the data. But first, you can see the WC-130J in comparison to the T6, which was first flown into a hurricane in 1943. So obviously our aircraft is much larger and much more equipped to be able to handle hurricanes and storms that we have to fly into. So as far as the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, we have 10 full-time ART crew positions is what we call them. And then we have 10 traditional reserve crews as well. So what that really means is we have 10 full-time crews equals about 50 people that actually live in Biloxi and work full-time 40-hour weeks that are also a part of the military. They're joined as far as a civilian and military. And then we have 10 traditional reservists that are Air Force, and they can live anywhere across the United States. So we have people that live in Seattle, Kansas City, New York, and then they'll come once a month or during hurricane season and help augment the crews to make sure that we can fly and meet our requirements. As far as the 5 personnel, so typically on a minimum storm flight, as far as minimum crew, we need 5 individuals to fly. So we have the 2 pilots up front that you see pictured here. And then we have the navigator, and they focus on a lot of the fuel type plans to ensure that we meet our requirements as far as fuel, as well as they keep us out of the worst part of the storms. They're kind of our radar experts that ensure that we stay out of a lot of the V notches that we consider to be tornadic type activity. And then in the back here, we have the loadmaster or the dropson operator. And so they're pre-flighting the aircraft before we step out to make sure that it's good to go on a maintenance level, as well as releasing the dropsons that you saw pictured in the video. That's their primary job. They're working hand in hand with the aerial reconnaissance weather officer, which is my job. And we also sit in the back in the cargo compartment as well. And our primary job is to quality check the data. As you can see on the computer screen there, a lot of numbers are filtering in, whether it's the horizontal aircraft data that we're analyzing, or it's the dropsons as they fall to the surface, we get that vertical profile of the atmosphere. And we're also having to be the liaison between the National Hurricane Center, what they're wanting to see, and talking to the front end of our crew, so the pilots and navigators, and making sure that we're all on the same page. So that's kind of primarily our job, is to be the mission director and quality control of the data. So the mission, as far as how we understand what we need to fly, is we have a reg called the National Hurricanes Operations Plan, and that kind of dictates how we operate. So every year we meet with different government agencies, whether that's the National Hurricane Center, Department of Commerce, different agencies from different levels that can kind of come in and implement what we need and what we need as a military aspect to make sure that we can meet the requirements that are dictated. And so the big one is that we obviously have to be able to fly 24 hours a day, and we have to be able to fly 3 storms at a time with 16 hours of notice. So that's very short notice when you really think about getting our pieces in place, if you will, especially if there's a storm. Let's say it's further out in the Pacific. We have to start thinking, and that's a big part of what Colonel Wilmot's job is to get the assets out and in place in time to ensure that we can meet the NHOP, the National Hurricane Operations Plan requirements. So here in 2017, you can see a great example of how we had to fly 3 different storms at one time. So we had Katia in the Gulf, a very powerful Hurricane Irma that was approaching Cuba and Florida, and then Hurricane Jose, which was also a major hurricane further out in the Atlantic. So this required us to fly multiple storms from 3 different locations, actually. We were flying, I believe it was from Keesler, Homestead, and St. Croix. I may be off on those locations at this exact time, but it becomes a very logistical problem on making sure that all of our pieces and aircraft are allocated in the right spots, as well as our aircrew and maintenance. As far as our area of responsibility, this is also highlighted in the National Hurricanes Operation Plan. So anywhere in the red pictured here is what we are responsible for flying. So if there's a storm way out in the Atlantic, you can see about 52.5 west, all the way out past Hawaii in the Pacific. We'll fly any storm in that area that is threatening land or could potentially threaten land. And that doesn't just go for the United States. We'll fly storms that potentially could impact Mexico or any of the Caribbean islands, and even Canada to an extent. Has been situations where Canada's been impacted. And so we have to allocate our resources. I think it was a couple years ago, we actually had to move aircraft up to, I believe it was Niagara, New York, and we were flying storms as they were going further up into the northeastern part of the United States. So it's always a challenge to make sure that we can cover this entire scope. And so typically we'll operate out of 3 locations. Obviously, Keesler Air Force Base, there in Biloxi, Mississippi. But if we need to reach out more into the Atlantic Ocean, we'll move to St. Croix and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And then we'll go to Barbers Point, Hawaii. If there's any storms that are impacting the Hawaiian Islands, that's kind of our go-to location, which can get interesting because if there's actually a storm heading for the Hawaiian Islands, there's not a lot of places for us to be able to what we call hurry back and move our aircraft. So that can also become a logistical thought of making sure that our assets aren't in the path of a developing storm. So a lot of people are familiar, obviously, with our hurricane missions. They seem to get the most attention as they're the strongest and pose the most impact for land and people. But one of the trickiest missions that we do are what we call low-level invests. So these are when there's hardly even a storm. Sometimes there's not even a storm at this time. And it's over the open Atlantic waters, for example, and we'll fly at anywhere from 500 to 1,500 feet above the water. And we are literally investigating the surface of the water to try to see where the winds are out of as far as the direction and how strong they are, the wind speeds. So this is very tricky for the meteorologists on board. These are our hardest missions as we are looking, as you can see in this picture here, staring at the water with what we call a whiz wheel to get an idea of what wind direction the winds are out of. So we're looking at where the white caps are moving or blowing to, if you will, and then how much foam or bubbles or the color of the water that can help us understand how strong the winds are. And as what we're trying to do, we're trying to find winds moving in all 4 directions or quadrants of the storm. So I think we have a graphic here next that kind of illustrates that. Hopefully it's next. Yes, perfect. So you can see these are kind of the winds that we're looking for. And if we see winds in all 4 quadrants, like pictured there in the red, then our National Hurricane Center can better understand that there perhaps could be a named storm, whether it's a tropical depression or tropical storm. And then, of course, we have our hurricane missions. And our typical pattern that we fly is the alpha pattern. This is a great way for us to be able to sample all 4 quadrants of the storm. Once again, so you can see through 2 different passes through the eye, we're seeing all kind of angles of the storm that we can get, at least a good amount of data. And we're also going through that center 2 times, which then can extrapolate the movement and speed in which the storm's moving. So that's very important information for the National Hurricane Center. But a lot of times, it's not just about finding that center. It's seeing how far those winds stretch out from the center, as that impacts greatly. For example, Hurricane Katrina, when the wind or the surge of the water was so important, and flying further out from the eye kind of gives a better idea to the National Hurricane Center on how much storm surge is going to be in the storm. And then we have the dropson. So this is one of our main weather equipments that we're releasing into the storm to get an idea of what's going on. So this data is constantly, every 10 minutes, being sent out to the National Hurricane Center. And then when we receive a dropson, the data is coming in 3 times every second to the aircraft when it's falling from the sky. And as it's doing so, both the loadmaster and the meteorologist on board are quality checking the data. And then once it hits the water, we do a final review of it, and then we'll send it to the Hurricane Center. You can see pictured here, there's a lot of different pieces that go into it, but really from the outside, it's just a shell of cardboard is what it looks like, with a little bit of circuit inside that gets all the data that we need. And you can see the parachute ejects from the top of the dropson once it's released from the aircraft. But it's sending back information, wind direction, wind speed, pressure, temperature, and dew point, or relative humidity, while it's falling. And in the hurricane environment, we always try to focus on these 3 locations. So this is kind of a cross-section view of the hurricane as we're flying through. So you can see the 2 eye walls, and then there in the middle is the eye, of course. And so we're trying to do 2 different things primarily. When we're flying through the eye wall, we want to release a dropson and actually get the strongest winds possible, so we know what the strongest winds are at the surface. The hard thing is we're flying roughly 10,000 feet above the water, and that's a long ways for a son to fall when we're experiencing winds of sometimes 150 to 200 miles per hour. So that son's going a long ways away from where we actually release it. So finding those maximum surface winds are very challenging, but the data throughout the column of the air that the son's falling through gives a great picture to the National Hurricane Center of what's going on in the storm. And then, of course, we have our center drop that is very critical as well, because that finds the exact center of the storm. And it's oftentimes not where you'd think looking on a satellite, even though there's a clear pictured eye. Maybe it's a few miles off from the exact center that appears to be on satellite. So that's a tricky thing to find. And we're ultimately trying to find the lowest pressure possible in the center. And then we have the step frequency microwave radiometer. It's we shorten it to the acronym SFMR because that is a mouthful to continuously say. But this is a relatively new piece of equipment. It actually, Hurricane Katrina was the big trial for it, where it actually, so it's a passive sensor that I like to think of it as an eyeball. So it doesn't shoot any beams out. It's simply looking at the water below the aircraft, and it can see through clouds and whatnot. And it allows us to see, or the pod to see, the different bubbles or streaks that are going on at the water, and how bright or how white the water becomes through wind tells the pod how strong the winds are, and that gives us a surface wind speed. And it's very accurate, and it is an exceptional tool that helps us understand what exactly is going on at the surface, and not just from a dropson perspective at one point, but it's constantly collecting that data. So Hurricane Katrina was a big breakthrough for this sensor, and now it's equipped on all of our aircraft and is operationally required according to the National Hurricane Operation Plan. All right, next slide. Perfect. So buoys is something that has been a lot in the experimental phases, but it's now operational as well, meaning that it's required for us to do, if needed, by the National Hurricane Center. And you can see pictured here, these are going out the back of the C-130 through that yellow tube pictured there on the screen. So we're releasing different types of buoys in these images, but a lot of times we'll either do that out in front of a hurricane, or pictured going through the yellow tube, we'll do that in the actual hurricane environment. And is what that is doing is it's giving us a whole different view of what's going on in the hurricane, oftentimes below water, which is a very important piece of data that we've kind of been missing throughout the years. It's kind of that missing ingredient that could help better understand how the atmosphere and the ocean interact with each other, and ultimately whether the storm is going to intensify or weaken potentially. So there's a lot of different information that it can collect that we simply haven't been getting in years past, and it could be a big breakthrough in the science and hurricane forecasting world. As far as the stadium effect, so once we get in the eye, what are we looking at? This is what we're looking at. So we always like to try to put an image of a football stadium because that is legitimately how it looks in a very strong hurricane. This picture here is a major hurricane. I'm not for sure which one. I think this is Hurricane Irma, but I'm not positive. But they all have that similar dome picture when you're inside. It's literally a mountain or a straight wall of clouds that surround you. It's pretty inspiring, to be honest. It's humbling. It's, you know, it's strong and powerful, but it's also really beautiful. And a lot of people don't get those kind of views. As you can see, the sun rays are poking through in the clear blue skies above. And often, not in this picture, but sometimes you can actually see the water and it's clear below. It looks like there's a little bit more lower clouds in this storm. But the stadium effect is kind of an iconic way that we can see and we know if it's a powerful storm just by the human eye. So I've mentioned a lot the National Hurricane Center and the Department of Commerce. So the National Hurricane, of course, National Hurricane Center works for the Department of Commerce. It's a subcomponent, and that's where our data is going. And we are constantly chatting and sending that information to the National Hurricane Center and the hurricane forecasters. So we have what we call CARCA. It's the individuals pictured there on the right image. And they're actually part of our squadron here, located in Mississippi. They just have an office in Miami, but they are huge, huge help and a great resource for us to be able to, once again, send our information to, and they kind of ensure that everything's accurate from our end as well. And also are there in Miami to be able to speak and interact with the forecasters in person. So a lot of people ask this question, and I know with most of our audience, if not all, being on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, you guys understand how important this data is. But you can see this graphic is from 2004, and it's, you know, the cone of uncertainty that we're all used to seeing. And I think if you hit the button here, it'll show the red, perfect. So this is what the cone of uncertainty would look like without our data. So you can see it would stretch from about Tampa, Florida, all the way to the Texas-Louisiana border if we didn't have our data. That is a lot more uncertainty in land that decision makers would have to make as far as getting evacuations prepped to ensure that people are safe. And you also don't want to ring the bell of alarm if it doesn't need to be rang, as far as a public standpoint of ensuring that if we're saying that something's going to occur, that there's a good chance that it will, for the false alarm type perspective. But the data is absolutely important, and it's estimated that for every mile of coastline that has to evacuate, it's roughly $1 million. And I think that stat came from 2004, 2005. So I can only imagine in today's world, it's probably much more than even $1 million now. So once again, the amount of difference that this data, you can see how wide that cone is here. This was Hurricane Katrina after it left the coast of Florida and the Keys. And at that time, it had, I think, making landfall as a Category 2 in the Florida Panhandle. And then I think if you hit next slide here. Yeah, so now you can see how much smaller that cone of uncertainty is. So if you can go back, can we show kind of back and forth here how much wider that uncertainty is in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina to, I think this was 2017, this next one, 2018, excuse me. But that storm's way out in the Atlantic, and they ended up getting the forecast landfall location within 2 miles, and that storm is way out in the Atlantic. So you can see how far the forecasting has come over the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's rather remarkable, and a lot of that's due to satellites and computers, but a lot of it is still with our enhancements of our data. So 2019, it was a pretty busy year, 18 named storms, which was above average. And it was the fourth in a row. So we have been very busy at the 53rd over the last few years. And really the big one was Category 5 Dorian, as it made landfall, unfortunately, on the Bahamas as one of the strongest hurricanes ever to make landfall in the Atlantic Basin. And I think the next slide shows kind of a graphic of where all the storms perfect. And you can see the brighter purples, the magenta is where those major hurricanes were at. We had a couple in the Gulf there. Hurricane, I think, yeah, it became a hurricane right before landfall. Barry was the closest to the Mississippi coast, and that was early in the year. But no real large threats in the Mississippi area last year, fortunately. So 2020, we're barely into June, and we've already are on our third named storm, as I'm sure everyone is very familiar with, especially with Cristobal and the Gulf of Mexico. Well, over Mexico right now, but it looks like it's about to head back into the Gulf, unfortunately. So Colonel Wilmot's been very busy with the crews and making sure that we're all taken care of as far as continuing to fly that mission when needed. But it's been a very early active season so far. So we do our hurricane mission, of course. We've highlighted that, the low-level invest, the different elements that takes. And that's the top bar here, the NHOP, National Hurricane Operation Plan. But you can see that's not the only thing we do. We also have the NSWAP there, the Winter Storm Operations Plan. So it's similar to the hurricane plan, but it's based on a lot of nor'easters that go up the East Coast and provide a lot of snowfall for highly populated areas, but also atmospheric river in the Pacific Ocean. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into that coming up. But we also accomplish a lot of different aeromedical type operations that is more typical of a C-130 in the military. So we still have those functions and capabilities. So here's the atmospheric river mission that I briefly talked about that's in the NSWAP. So I would say January through March is really the busiest time of year as far as a workload for us. We operate out of typically California and Hawaii, but we're able to move up to Oregon and Washington as well. But why this is so important is you can kind of see here the brighter colors starting to stream up towards California here. That is a moisture plume, often referred as the Pineapple Express. I don't know if that's a familiar term, but really it's bringing a lot of tropical moisture from the equator south of Hawaii and stretching it up towards the West Coast. And that causes 30 to 50% of the annual precipitation for California. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with how dry California can get with the wildfires and whatnot and the shortage of water. So understanding how to manage the dams and to make sure that the water is in the right location, that they're not flooding or wasting the water is very important economically for the West Coast. So us going out and collecting this data has greatly enhanced these forecasts to help decision makers know where to move the water. I think these next two images here, yeah, they show different flight routes. So one from California, the purple, and then the green or blue is from Hawaii. And you can see how they're kind of converging out towards the central part of the Pacific there with the little dots representing the drop zones where we're releasing our data. Another very important thing is in the off season primarily is for us to get the word of our mission out and to help people be prepared and understand the impacts that hurricanes can cause. And so we typically do, except for this year, unfortunately, with the world that we're living in with COVID-19, but the Chat in the Hat And the chat is the Caribbean Hurricane Awareness Tour. So pictured on the bottom here is actually in Mexico. So we'll fly our C-130 to different Caribbean islands as well as Mexico, and let different schools and different political leaders maybe come through the aircraft where we can talk about safety, talk about our mission, and impacts of hurricanes to make sure that people are ready. We usually do this in the April to May timeframe before hurricane season really gets ramped up. But then the hat is the Hurricane Awareness Tour for the United States. So we alternate doing the East Coast and then the Gulf of Mexico every other year. And it's the similar type rhythm as far as getting a lot of schools through the aircraft, and then doing a lot of media interviews as well to make sure that we're getting our word out and making sure that people are aware that hurricane season's coming. So now I'll turn it over to a virtual aircraft tour with Lieutenant Colonel Ragusa, and he'll kind of walk you through the insides of the plane.
Welcome to Keesler Air Force Base. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Ragusa, Chief Pilot for the Air Force Reserve's 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron Hurricane Hunters. I'd like to introduce you to our airplane. There are only 12 airplanes in the world allowed to fly in the hurricanes. 10 of them are flown by our squadron here based in Mississippi. This is tail number 5300, and I'm going to walk you around this one just to tell you a few things about the airplane. A lot of people ask if the airplane was beefed up at all. What makes it so strong that it can fly through a hurricane? As it turns out, all airplanes are built to withstand high winds. This one wasn't strengthened at all to be able to sustain the type of forces that we experience in a hurricane. We did ask a couple of things special when we asked them when we helped them decide what type of airplane to use years later. We made sure that we had a turboprop airplane. We have 4 jet engines spinning these propellers. You really wouldn't want to take any other type of airplane through a hurricane, so we're happy to have those. We do have some additional equipment obviously put on the airplane so that we can gather all the data that were in there to look for the National Hurricane Center. You can see hanging underneath the right wing of all of our airplanes, something that we affectionately refer to as the Smurf. It's the step frequency microwave radiometer. Really just means it's a magic piece of equipment that helps us figure out what the wind speed is on the surface of the water. All right, come around the right side of the airplane toward the tail. You can tell all of our airplanes because it tells you so right on the tail. This is one of our Hurricane Hunter airplanes. As we make our way to the ramp, which we need when we're doing a cargo mission, but not inside the hurricane, we keep the airplane all very closed up the whole time. But you can see this is the ramp that we would use if we ever needed to unload and offload cargo. Welcome aboard. Let's come on inside and see what we have. You'll see that it's much larger than we need it to be for our minimum crew of 5. We do typically have more than 5 people on board the airplane because we're constantly training new people. But you can see plenty of room inside here. You'll notice on the side of the airplane, looks like insulation. That's exactly what it is. As we make our way to and from the hurricane, at 35,000 feet, it could be minus 50 degrees outside. So we're happy to have a little bit of insulation. As you make your way toward the working area of the airplane, the first place we'll stop is to talk to you about our drops on station. We have 2 weather experts that spend their time in the back of the airplane here. On the right side of the aircraft is where our dropson operator sits. This is his or her station right here. This is what we refer to as our cannon. From this spot, we can launch dropsons from the airplane all the way down to the surface of the water, but the whole time they're falling, they're gathering all sorts of helpful information, transmitting that information back to the aircraft so that we can in turn make sure it's good data, combine it with other information, and send it via satellite every few minutes to the National Hurricane Center so we can get that information out to the forecasters and out to the public just as quickly as possible. This is what our dropson looks like. We might send out 12 or so on any given mission. Another reason we picked the C-130 as our aircraft is because it'll stay airborne for about 14 hours if we need it to. carrying about 60,000 pounds of jet fuel. That gives us the opportunity to sit in the hurricane for at least 6 hours on every mission, taking our time, slowing the airplane down for safety, and also to gather as much helpful information as we can. Continuing on up front toward the airplane, I'll show you where our meteorologist sits. On the left side of the aircraft as we make our way through the airplane, you'll see our meteorology station. We have a fully qualified meteorologist on board the airplane on every one of our hurricane missions. The technical name is the Aerial Reconnaissance Weather Officer, or ARWO for short. This is the person that's really the reason that we're out there, is to get this person the information that they need. They're pretty much in charge of where we go and when and what type of information we're looking for. We also tell them that this is the smartest person on board the airplane. As we make our way through the storm, they're in constant contact via text, and they can even pick up a phone and talk to the forecaster back at the National Hurricane Center, just to ensure that we're not out there for nothing. We're out there to get the very best information we can. All right, let's make our way up front. I'll show you where I sit. All right, now we're on the flight deck of the C-130. We have 3 positions up here, required positions. We also have toward the aft end of our flight deck our set of bunk beds. So if you're the type of person that can take a nap while your airplane's flying through a hurricane, we have a place for you to do it. Right behind our co-pilots where our navigator sits. A lot of modern aircraft don't have navigators anymore. We retain that crew position on our airplane because they're our radar expert. They're really good at finding things like tornadoes. People think we do everything in an airplane that can be done weather-wise. We have no idea what would happen if we flew one through a tornado, and it's his or her job to make sure that we don't find out. So they're going to help us stay away from those. Then all the way up front, we have our co-pilot seat and my seat here to the left. All right, now I'm sitting in one of the pilot seats of the aircraft. I can show you my favorite part of the airplane. Has nothing to do with flying into hurricanes, but it is pretty cool for the C-130. We have our heads-up display. It is literally a pane of glass with a projector above our heads, shining all of our flight information onto that pane of glass so that we can look outside and at our flight instruments all at the same time. Again, has nothing to do with hurricane hunting, but in the world of flying airplanes, kind of a big deal. Very spacious flight deck up here. We'll always have an aircraft commander and a co-pilot in the right seat, just part of our 5-person team to help get the job done. Do me a favor, and as you go on about your day and entering hurricane season, perhaps when you're watching this, make sure that you're not asking our flight crews to go into that hurricane for nothing. We'll do our part. We'll keep doing that for you. You do your part. Be prepared and pay attention to what they tell you. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.
All right, and that was our virtual tour of the WC-130J. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Ragusa. And at this time, that completes our briefing. So we'll go over to questions, and Colonel Wilmot and myself will hopefully be able to answer any questions you guys may have.
Okay, we actually do have a couple of questions coming in, but again, for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, if you would like to ask a question, you can use our chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, or the Q&A box if you would like to ask a question anonymously. So please feel free to keep those coming in, but we do have a couple. The first one is, how many storms do you typically fly into and track each season?
Well, it completely varies. Some seasons it may be as few as 10. Last year, I believe it was 18. And obviously not every named storm will actually fly through. So I would say, usually I would say about 12 is a good average of storms that we'll fly to. And sometimes that may just be 1 or 2 flights. And other times, like Hurricane Dorian last year, it'll end up being, I think we were in the 50s as far as missions flown between us and NOAA, the P3s. Over 50 missions were flown into Hurricane Dorian. So it really is dependent on the year, and it has a pretty wide spectrum.
Wow. And did you take a nap on any of those trips?
Sometimes on the way home, I'll get a little quick shut-eye, but during the hurricane environment, it can be a little difficult.
I can imagine. Okay, the next question we have is, what is the most dangerous storm you've ever flown in?
For me, it would probably be Irma. Flying through that at night. It was off the coast of Cuba before it turned north to come over the Florida Keys. I'm fairly new to this. I've only been here for 3 years, so I've talked about, well, with the experienced guys, what is the worst, or how bad can it get? And they say, well, normally with the pilots, when one is just trying to keep the wings level and the other one's just trying to keep the airspeed, they one will run the throttles and the other one will be on the flight controls. And then that's only for a few seconds, usually going through the eye, or if we hit some clear air turbulence or something to that effect. And they say that hardly ever happens, and most guys never see it their whole flying career. But this was probably my third storm that I flew in, and it happened 3 times on that. And it's at night, so you don't have a whole lot of peripheral vision. You're always on the instruments, and but yeah, that was probably the worst of it.
Whoa. What about you, Captain Black?
From an intensity standpoint, it was Hurricane Dorian last year. It was a Category 5, but it actually, so that was from an intensity of a storm perspective. That was the strongest that I flew through. As far as a personal experience, as far as a ride, it's usually, at least from my standpoint, it's been the tropical storms or some of the weaker storms that have actually been bumpier, as they're either rapidly intensifying or decaying, where you get a lot more unorthodox patterns going on in the storm dynamically. So yeah, we always make the joke that you never know what you're going to get when you pass through it. Sometimes you may expect a clear, smooth ride and it's really bumpy. And then the next time you go through it, it'll be completely smooth. And it seems to be very random, even though I'm sure there's a lot more going on that meets the eye that maybe I don't understand yet.
Hey, it sounds like it keeps you on your toes, and that's what the job's all about, right?
That's right.
We do have a couple more questions. One of them is, what made you want to fly directly into hurricanes?
I can answer this. I've flown combat aircraft, C-130s for a while, and I got the opportunity to become the director of operations. It is unique, and to be honest with you, it's the closest thing that we do as the United States military that affects the American public directly. I've deployed several times throughout my career. Happy to do that, but every time we go up, we know exactly who we're affecting, and it's our own friends and family. We live here on the coast with you guys, so we know how and what you need as far as from us. And every time you go up, you know exactly who you're doing it for.
Oh, absolutely. Great answer. Captain Black, did you want to answer that as well?
I think he hit it on the spot, honestly. That was a great answer to follow up. But on a personal level, I guess I grew up in Kansas with tornadoes, and so I always had a great appreciation for severe weather, whether that's tornadoes in Kansas or hurricanes over the Gulf of Mexico or Atlantic. So I think from a scientific perspective, I've always been interested in wanting to understand more and more of what goes into that. So I greatly enjoy that and being able to actually go out and see it. But like Colonel Wilmot said, knowing that it directly impacts communities along the coast, especially when you live on a community on the coast, it becomes very personal as well.
I can imagine. And Colonel Wilmot, that sounded like the first time you had ever had that question asked to you. So, okay, last question we have is this. And they asked, why is a jet engine like the type found on a commercial airliner not used on a Hurricane Hunter plane?
I can answer that for us. So the turboprop affords us the ability for turboprop to jet. There's actually some efficiencies at lower speeds with the turboprop and certain lift aspects. It's actually just more efficient for that. However, if you look at a jet engine, you see that big giant hole in the front, and that actually sucks in a lot of water, which actually does affect the engine's ability to operate. And with the turboprops, we just don't ingest as much water. So it's actually a safer airplane to fly.
Would have never guessed that. So that was the last question we had. And to wrap things up, I want to thank you so much, Colonel Wilmot and Captain Black, for taking the time to come speak with us. We really appreciate it. And on the behalf of the Mississippi Gulf Coast Chamber of Commerce, we really appreciate all that you do. And if you have any questions or if you would like to join the Coast Centurion Association, you can find the application and my contact information at mscoastchamber.com. And on that note, I wish you both safe travels in the upcoming crazy hurricane season. It looks like it's going to be. And if you need anything from us, you know where to find us as well. Do y'all have any parting thoughts or anything to leave us with?
Stay healthy, stay safe out there.
Absolutely.
Right.
And thanks for having us on. Appreciate it.
Of course. And on that note, I hope everybody has a great chamber day and a fantastic weekend. And be sure you're staying safe, like Colonel Wilmot said. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.